Well, good evening, everyone. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here for our special ceremony. My name is Varun Soni. I'm the Dean of Religious Life here at the University of Southern California. And on behalf of the University of Southern California, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our event, which we do every year, Remembering 9/11. And we do it right here because right here we have a 9/11 memorial. We have steel from the World Trade Center that was donated to the university by the September 11th Families Association, the Fire Department of New York. It's really one of the only 9/11 memorials in the city of Los Angeles, and it's a wonderful reminder of the great sacrifice that our law enforcement, our first responders, our fire, medics make every day for our public safety. As we begin today's ceremony, I now ask that everyone rise as they are able in body and spirit for the presentation of colors by the USC Naval ROTC Color Guard. They will be joined by the USC DPS cadets. I now invite Sergeant Alma Burke of the Los Angeles Police Department to join me on the podium to sing the national anthem, and I ask that you remain standing for the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave.
So it's my great honor to welcome you today on behalf of the many sponsors, departments, committees, and groups that have come together to make this ceremony possible this year and every year. In particular, I am very grateful to the September 11th Families Association, the Fire Department of New York, the Department of Public Safety, the Undergraduate Student Government, the Price School of Public Policy, and the Office of Religious Life. Today we remember 9/11 even though we have never forgotten it. We gather as a university community to remember the thousands of innocent victims who died in the horrific attacks 16 years ago in rural Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., and New York City. Today we pay tribute to the first responders, the firefighters, police officers, and medics who were killed in the courageous and selfless service of others. Today we honor the heroes of United Flight 93 who sacrificed their own lives for the security and well-being of our country. And today we pray for those who lost their loved ones on 9/11, the parents, siblings, children, spouses, and friends who have suffered immeasurably since then. And so now at this time, I ask everyone rise again as you are able in spirit to observe a moment of silence to honor the memory of those we lost on 9/11. 9/11 was an American tragedy and also a global tragedy. More than 90 countries were represented in the deaths in the World Trade Center. And in the 16 years since 9/11, other nations have also been victimized by devastating terrorist attacks. Norway and Spain, England and Indonesia, India and Pakistan, Iraq and Syria, France and Turkey, and so many others. So today we mourn together as a global Trojan family, a family that represents virtually every state in our country, every nation in our world, and every religion on our planet. So let us affirm that this moment of remembrance is also a call for action, engagement, and reconciliation. Let us acknowledge that our university community is an inspiring example of how this world can work together, creatively and collaboratively, across disciplines and domains, in order to achieve our common goals and our shared aspirations. Let us realize that our faith traditions should be part of the solution to the world's great crises and not part of the problem. And let us all say together, amen. Today we are so fortunate to hear thoughts, reflections, and tributes from many of our university leaders who will speak to us in the following order. First, we'll have Dr. Jack Knott, the Dean of the Price School of Public Policy, followed by Austin Dunn, the President of the Undergraduate Student Government, followed by John Thomas, Chief of the USC Department of Public Safety, followed by Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Nelson, the Commander and Chair of the Department of Aerospace Studies at the Air Force ROTC Corps at USC. I now ask my friend and colleague, Dean Jack Knott, to join me at the podium.
Today, as we look back on this great national tragedy, I am mindful that in the 16 years since, there have been almost daily attacks all over the world. The threats we face have shifted from national conflicts and conventional warfare to radicalized individuals and organizations that span a range of ideologies that likewise threaten our values and our lives. Just in the past year, we have seen attacks in the United States from Fresno, California, to Charlottesville, Virginia. Last year, Nobel laureate, human rights and peace activist Elie Wiesel passed away. Wiesel survived the Holocaust and lived through 9/11, and he was always clear and forceful about the response to terrorism, extremism, and hate. He said, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." He goes on to say that when human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and insensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. So as we mark 9/11, we recognize that we are members of a global family. And every single day of the year, someone in the globe is confronted with hate, terrorism, displacement, or death. As a global school with a diverse family of student staff and faculty from around the world, we should take a moment today to not only remember the sacrifices of those lives in 9/11, but also to acknowledge the ongoing suffering around the world and our responsibility to alleviate that suffering. We think of those living in the civil war in Syria, the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and those experiencing famine, drought, and war in Yemen, Somalia, and Sudan. And we think of those digging out from Harvey and Irma, and of the millions in South Asia who have been flooded out of their homes and communities. There is really no region of the world that has not been touched by these kinds of disasters. After 9/11, however, we also saw our country come together in a way that we have rarely seen. People looked past their differences to help and support each other in a moment of need. That noble impulse to stand together, even though it lasted for just a short time, is a profound reminder of how great and good we as humans can be. I believe that the only way that we can eradicate suffering in the world is to transcend the differences that separate us and focus on working together to solve these mutually shared challenges. Problem solving for the greater good is one of the fundamental tenets of USC and the Price School, shared across all of our degree programs. We believe in and we advocate for reaching across boundaries to solve public problems, including professional and disciplinary divides, levels of government, and across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to improve people and their communities where they live. That means being willing to engage with others who think, believe, and act differently than we do. those whose life experiences, culture, and values may be different from our own. And since 9/11, it seems even more difficult to find common ground. But I believe that the effort is integral to our social and civic duty, and something that each of us consciously must choose as a way of life. So on a day that calls for sober reflection, I encourage you to join me in thinking about a higher calling, in reaching across the boundaries that limit our choices. I'm reminded of the quote, "Your values will always be challenged in times of chaos, and that's exactly when they matter the most." So let us strive to be people who are committed to making our world a better place for every person and every community, and let us commit to gather to say and think and do that commitment. Thank you.
My name is Austin Dunn, and as mentioned, I have the privilege to serve as the undergraduate student body president. I am incredibly humbled and honored to be able to speak to you today on the 16th anniversary of one of the most devastating and most consequential days in the history of our country. The legacy of September 11th has endured throughout our society, and more importantly, 2,996 people are still missed by thousands more loved ones. Those wounds will never heal, and they should never be diminished. But I would like to strike a different tone today. On September 11th, 2001, I was 6 years old and only in kindergarten. I would venture to guess that of all the speakers here today, I am the only one who was sheltered from the immediate shock and horror. That is not to say that it wasn't an ominous, confusing day, but it was nonetheless a day that was, for me, impossible to understand at the time. With that in mind, my perspective allows me to approach this day of solemn remembrance with an additional resilience and optimism. From a purely analytical standpoint, September 11th was the worst attack on American soil at any time in the last 75 years. It represents the most significant attack on American society and American values since World War II. Yet, we are still here. Our society was built on unshakable ideas, including but not limited to the importance of diversity, freedoms of speech and religion, and an openness and entrepreneurial spirit that opened our doors to the world. Since our inceptions, others have resented those foundational principles. And despite that resentment, despite attacks, we as a people move forward in the same way, abiding by those foundational principles that have made our country a target for attack, but also a goal to aspire towards. But we as Americans use events like September 11th not just as an advertisement for our toughness, but also as platforms through which to evaluate ourselves. 16 years ago, a country rallied together to combat extremism and to comfort our brothers and sisters in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. It's moments like that that give me hope. In our darkest hours, not only do we as a people lean on our foundational principles, but we show our greatest personal qualities. Some of that has, unfortunately, been lost in recent years. The spirit of togetherness that grew out of the tragedy on September 11th, 2001, has been diminished over the years since. Some of us are finding the idea of coming together as a less attractive proposition in the face of economic hardship and political polarization. That is why days like today must be more than just about the remembrance of tragedy, but also the remembrance of the response. Today, I urge you to reach out to someone who needs reaching out to. Act on our nation's foundational principles in defiance of hardships. Only then will you truly be doing the memory of the souls lost 16 years ago justice. Thank you.
Well, welcome to the University of Southern California and its Department of Public Safety. Thank you for being here at our annual memorial ceremony where we remember not only a fateful day in our nation's history, but we also remember the nearly 3,000 lives taken from us so violently that day. As a first responder and as a representative of a great and noble calling, which is American law enforcement, it is a great honor to also recognize the courage and sacrifices of the men and women who are the first responders who put themselves in harm's way that day to save people that they never knew. Over 400 of those brave public servants lost their lives. But had they not entered the towers as they were collapsing and engulfed in flames with little regard for their own personal safety, many more lives would have been lost that day. So on this, the 16th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks that changed our nation and our profession forever, as we stand here at one of but a few, I think it's only 2, permanent memorial markers actually located in the city of LA that's from the World Trade Center, let us not forget all of the lives that were lost, not forget the valiant service of our first responders, but let us also remember the families. 16 years may seem like a long time, but for the families who lost a loved one and those still struggling from debilitating illnesses, emotionally, physically, psychologically, I know that seems like only yesterday. And as I think about it, in essence, as Americans, we are all survivors of what happened on 9/11. But I also know that we are so much better, we're so much stronger, we're so much more resilient. And for us as first responders, despite these very challenging times, we've strengthened our homeland security, we've prevented attacks, and we're even more steadfast in our resolve to protect this country that we love. We are ever mindful that we are not only the defenders, or we defend our nation, but most importantly, we defend the American core values and ideals. So let us stay true to the spirit of this day and draw from that same spirit that we all witnessed, that Dean Knott talked about in those days that followed 9/11, where despite becoming aware that day of the violent capabilities of a common enemy, we also knew that that enemy was not each other. And at that time, we truly represented the best of the American spirit, unity. We not only came together despite our differences to rebuild and become stronger and more resilient, but we came together and became even more committed to those American ideals and values: liberty, equality, democracy, unity, individualism, diversity. We found our strength in these very ideals. Let us recommit ourselves to these ideals today as a reaffirmation of our nation's true character, one that's drawn from what President Obama liked to refer to as our patchwork heritage, which is American diversity. So in closing, I can't think of any greater recognition for the sacrifice lives made by those more than 3,000 first responders whose lives were lost that day than to show our consistent support and appreciation to the many thousands of police officers, firefighters, and other first responders that serve American communities 24/7, 365 days a year. We especially need that now more than ever before. So I thank you for being here. I pray for the safety of the first responders serving the USC campus community and those brave men and women serving communities across the nation as first responders. May God bless our great university, our city, and the United States of America.
I was very close to New York City on 9/11, and my life was very, very directly impacted by all of that. Certainly in the professional sense and in the familial sense in the military, perhaps not because I had anyone there in the towers, and I knew a lot of people in the Pentagon. I did not lose a loved one in the Pentagon, gratefully. But I hope you'll bear with me, as mine is a very personal reflection on that time. 16 years ago today, I was assigned to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. I was a young lieutenant, I was in love with a young captain, and I was sitting at my desk and I was writing invitations for our wedding. Wow, I may not get through this. When the towers fell, we were the closest base to New York City. And after that, it seemed like for the longest time that I could only remember things in spans of time that were tied to that day. They were measured according to that marker. Within minutes, as we all know, first responders in New York City began to arrive on the scene. Within minutes at McGuire, our air crews were put on alert, and I received word that I needed to go get rest because we were going to go into immediate 24-hour operations. Within hours, our KC-10 air crews were launching aerial refueling missions so that they could refuel those combat air patrol missions that were guarding our sovereign skies and keeping watch over our nation. When all other air traffic was grounded, those F-16s were protecting us from the air. The national news media set up camp right outside our gates, and special operations air crews arrived with their MH-53 helicopters, and they began to do overflights of Manhattan, both to try to observe any additional terrorist activity and also to help in whatever way they could in search and recovery efforts by feeding information from the air to the first responders on the ground. Within days of that moment, brave airmen from McGuire and many other bases around the country received short notice deployment orders, and they began packing. FEMA arrived at McGuire Air Force Base, and they set up at McGuire Air Force Base and began staging their operations, helping with the rescue and recovery effort from there. I worked for a two-star general at the time. He was my wing commander, and he departed within days for an undisclosed location in Southwest Asia where he would act as the director of mobility forces in preparation for a certain war that we knew that was to come against a cloaked enemy. Within weeks, we were launching airstrikes against the Taliban and against al-Qaeda positions in Afghanistan. Within those same weeks, I became a missus. Thankfully, they didn't cancel our wedding, although they talked about it. I transferred in those weeks to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. That's home to the Department of Defense Port Mortuary, where we continued to receive remains that were recovered from the Pentagon for DNA identification, and we received those remains on a daily basis for months. That would become the most somber, heart-wrenching, and honorable mission with which I would ever be associated. Over the ensuing years, my husband would deploy into the combat theater 8 times. I too would deploy, and I would experience the surreal feeling of setting foot on Iraqi soil, listening to a lone airman who was practicing the bagpipes in the middle of the night on an airfield in Afghanistan, and visiting many other countries in support of Operations Iraqi and Enduring Freedom. There was one thing that might surprise you that did not happen for a number of years associated with 9/11. For 5 years, I didn't shed a tear. It wasn't until United 93 was released, and I went to see it in a Washington, D.C. theater with a teammate of mine, a former teammate from that Dover team, that I allowed myself to be overcome with emotion about that day for the first time. And I can still count the number of times that I've given way to those feelings. Today marks the 6th. It happened again when I first visited the Pentagon Memorial, and every time I visited it since, with its thoughtful attention to the victims, both young and old, who were both on the airline and in the Pentagon. And later at the World Trade Center Memorial with its vast lonesomeness. Involuntary tears flowed again one morning at work in Germany when I received word that we had gotten Osama bin Laden, the architect of so much misery. That collection of moments 16 years ago have defined my entire adult life and the lives of my husband and our children and truly an entire generation. So what was wrong with me? That I didn't let myself feel it for so long. It all goes back to that day. It goes back to what first responders do. It goes back to what military members do. All the feelings that my psyche wanted to feel, I had to put into a neat little compartment because I had to get the mission done. That's what we do in the face of the unimaginable. The first responders in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania didn't spare a thought for their own lives. They didn't have time. They just got to work. They got to work doing what they did to help others. They did exactly what every single first responder in our nation is trained to do and what they would do upon if called upon in the exact same situation. It is the same with our military members. I am honored to call myself the daughter of a paramedic and the wife of a warrior. I'm honored by the sacrifice that so many made on that day and have made since. And I am deeply honored to be standing in your presence now. And I thank you for this opportunity. We need to always remember that if 9/11 is about nothing else, it's about digging deep and channeling our best selves for the good of others, even to the last breath. That's the heart of our national ethos. When others bring their very worst, we bring our very best, and we meet them together. That's how we honor the lost. Thank you for your time.
Thank you to Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Nelson for your very heartfelt and sincere and poignant remarks. I'm inspired by those remarks, and I want to also share, honestly, my experiences on 9/11 as well. On 9/11, I was a first-year student at the UCLA School of Law in the third week of classes, and I woke up early to the news. I went to class that morning in a daze. Everyone was devastated on campus. Students were crying in the hallways. People were calling loved ones on the East Coast. My uncle worked at the World Trade Center, and he happened to be late to work that morning, but many of his colleagues were not so lucky. I remember feeling numb that week, like we were all experiencing a national PTSD, and we knew things would change forever in our lives and also in the life of our nation. However, my experience may have been different than many other Americans. I felt tremendous patriotism and pride after 9/11, immense gratitude for the privilege of being American, intense solidarity with my fellow grieving Americans. But as an immigrant, as a brown man with a beard in America, and as someone with a family that includes Muslims and Sikhs, I also experienced a psychological dislocation after 9/11, because even as I felt great patriotism, I also felt backlash in terms of what it meant to be American. At the time, I was living in Pershing Square and Westwood Boulevard, right in the heart of Little Persia. And I sensed a similar mix of pride and fear in the Iranian-American community around me, pride of their American citizenship, fear of potential backlash, stereotyping, and distrust. In the weeks after 9/11, my family, my friends, my neighbors, and I experienced public discrimination, bias, and name-calling in a way that we never had before, especially those who wore turbans and hijabs. My Sikh friends tied their turbans with red, white, and blue fabric to celebrate their Americanness, but people kept calling them terrorists in order to denigrate their otherness. My dear friend Valerie Kaur, who is one of the great interfaith leaders in the United States today, is a Sikh American lawyer and filmmaker. Her uncle was the first person killed in a post-9/11 hate crime in Mesa, Arizona, for wearing a turban. And that tragedy inspired her to pick up her video camera and travel around the country to discover the soul of America, and eventually release her experiences as the award-winning documentary film, Divided We Fall. One of the stories she heard was of a Sikh man wearing a turban on a public bus after 9/11 in New York City. Another man accosted him by yelling and swearing at him, calling him a terrorist, lunging at him. The Sikh man was accustomed to this, but this level of intensity was new for him, and he was terrified. However, on the bus, the other bus riders stepped up to protect him, to stand in front of him, to reprimand the man who was yelling and screaming at him. The bus driver stopped the bus, and the riders gently escorted the angry man off the bus, shielding and comforting the Sikh man the whole time. Uplifted by his fellow New Yorkers' protection of him, the Sikh man decided to get off the bus in order to speak with the angry man, who began to cry when the Sikh man approached him. "I'm sorry," the man said. "I know that you're not responsible for 9/11. I'm sorry for yelling at you. I really am. But my daughter died in the World Trade Center, and I'm still grieving." The Sikh man, moved by his honesty, revealed to him that his daughter had also died many years ago, and that it took years before he could speak about her without crying. The two men embraced each other in the streets of New York that evening. Two fathers grieving for their daughters. Two human beings feeling each other's pain. Two Americans bound together in an extraordinary and life-affirming way. That aspiration and spirit of empathy, compassion, and reconciliation is what makes America great. And that's something we should all memorialize today. And that's something we all seem to need now more than ever before. And if we remain serious about fulfilling our nation's promise of liberty and equality, of inclusion and of openness, then together I know that we can build a more perfect union together. And I'm honored and humbled to do this work alongside of all of you. So as we conclude today, I'd like to thank once again all of our participants, the USC ROTC Color Guard, the DPS USC Cadets, Sergeant Alma Burke, Dean Jack Knott, USG President Austin Dunn, Chief John Thomas, Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Nelson. Most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out this evening. Please take care of yourself, please take care of each other, and fight on. And as we conclude, I now invite Eric Matheny to conclude this ceremony with taps.